Welcome to How Things Connect, where we share insight and wisdom on healing, empowerment, and regeneration. I'm so excited today to have as my guest Ganga Devi Braun. Ganga is a facilitator, a regenerative counselor, ritualist, writer, ecologist, and community cultivator who weaves ontological design and living systems theory into everything that she does. She is an interspiritual minister and applies the formulas of religious and spiritual technology to creating dynamic spaces that celebrate pluralism, weave collective wisdom, and support meaning making, all the while harmonizing with the living systems that we are. Welcome, Ganga.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm so glad to be here.
I'm so excited that you're here. So, I always marvel at the way that you were brought up. You were born and raised in one of the few experimental land-based communities founded in the 1970s that has actually withstood the test of time. And, every moment of your life, it seems, has been experienced through the lens of diverse and pluralistic collaboration. Can you share more about how your childhood was and how that impacted you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, gladly. I was recently speaking with one of my elders who's been connected with the community I was raised in for decades about this, and about the many blessings and the many challenges of our specific community, and so it's very much on my mind right now. But I'll just paint a little bit of a picture of what the grounds of the community that I was raised on are like, the physical environment. Which is that the community is all kind of centered around a central body of water, which we call the Ganga, which is named after the body of water, the sacred pilgrimage site, the Ganges in India, which I'm also named after the goddess that the river is a personification of. And around that central body of water, there are all of these outdoor open air temples to different religious traditions. Because we're based in Florida, it's gardens are infused into everything. And my mother and father were, my father was one of the architects who informed the building of those temples, and my mother and he were the head gardeners. And so I was raised, literally doing like Easter egg hunts in this beautiful outdoor space that is in honor of Judaism, that shows the 10 Commandments in Hebrew, and is a really beautiful outdoor space. And then going over to a Kali temple and to a little like Zen Buddhist grove, just all around, just kind of moving through all of these spaces. And the tradition that I was raised within is very much focused on loving everyone and reducing harm, essentially. The root guru, Neem Karoli Baba, of the lineage I was raised in, one time to Ram Dass, he said, there's only two things that you need to do. You need to love everyone and tell the truth. And Ram Dass very famously responded, I can't love everyone, and that's the truth. They're very simple, but they're very difficult kind of injunctions. But the community that I was raised in really, in as many ways as possible during the time, tried to embody those principles by creating a space where people of every background, every religious background, every sexual and gender identity, everything was really welcome. And that was a very challenging, like radical kind of thing beginning in the 70s and 80s during the AIDS crisis. Our community was really leading the way in terms of really outspoken support for and really embodied support for people who were dying of AIDS. And so that was kind of the world that I was raised in, was really focused on service, really focused on inclusivity, and also was like not without its flaws. Like the community itself is actually incredibly white, and I think right now, like a lot of the community and our elders are looking at that and saying, like, what are the conditions in which we were so focused on plurality, but still we mostly attracted a lot of like white Americans, and how can we make sure that our space is proactively safe and inclusive and nurturing for people of all backgrounds, truly. So it continues to be a challenge, but one that I'm really grateful I was born into recognizing the challenge of. Yeah.
And because I know you mentioned, because the discomfort you mentioned as you grew up and realized it's like, wait a minute, a lot of the traditions and the ancient wisdom you were drawing from, they were from a lot of other cultures
Yeah.
and a lot of different disciplines um, and other people that you may not have included in your group. How did you actually reconcile that? And there's not, and by the way, I totally hear that also because, obviously there's been so much discussion about, decolonization and all of that. How have you weathered and how have you reconciled that within yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. It's an ongoing process. I think that it my own my own racial consciousness and understanding of a lot of these conversations really blossomed when I was in college, and I definitely during that time I think I really needed to take a step back from my own identification with the religions and the rituals and the practices and the philosophies that I was really deeply steeped in as a part of my identity, because I felt like
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's a combination of like white fragility plus a deep and genuine identification with Hinduism and Buddhism in particular. I felt like I couldn't deconstruct that if I was um, rigidly holding myself as like, well, this is who I am, and other people can just suck it if they have a problem with this. It was really a process of humility for me to say, I'm actually going to, at least in my own mind and in my own practice, like step back from ways that I claim these identities in presentation, and even even with my name, my first name is Ganga Devi. That's been my first name since I was born. But it is like I am named after a goddess, and that is something that a lot of people do without a lot of like people take on those names without a lot of consideration or conscientiousness, and
Yeah.
that can create harm. Like it can create a lot of inadvertent harm that a lot of white people, frankly, are completely oblivious to, in terms of people who already feel alienated from their cultures feeling even more so when they're encountering people who don't have a deep relationship with their culture and their tradition, claiming that as something like that as their name. So for a number of years I actually just went by Ganga as my first name, and it's been my own journey of like coming into like claiming this as my full name, but also being really happy to have conversations like this about it. And yeah, so during that time, I took a step back in some senses, but then I also took a deeper step forward where I started studying these things academically. I started studying Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, not just with the Tibetan Buddhist teacher that is my mother's teacher, who I have studied really in depth with over the years, but also from an academic perspective and understanding the history and the politics and also the language of Tibetan culture and also of Indian culture. And I had some really incredible Indian and Tibetan teachers while I was in school, who were so generous with how they helped me to make sense of my own positionality within these cultures and in relation to these cultures. And eventually, I was ordained with my husband as an interspiritual minister, and that journey was also a part of me and he, together, really wanting to understand how we can make best use of, and by use I don't mean as like an extractive resource, but from
Mm-hmm.
what we're holding inside of ourselves, from the traditions that we've been so generously invited into and exposed to. How can we serve other people who are struggling in the way that's most appropriate for us and most appropriate for the people that we're encountering? So it's something that continues to be a question and a process, and one that I think
Mm-hmm.
I will always be working through my entire life. And I think that the more we can, and by we I mean I guess like we as me as white people, spiritual white people, can be like transparent and comfortable and honest and having these kinds of conversations, including how we're struggling, I think the more it creates a space for an honest and safe and earnest conversation among everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Ganga. And by the way, I'm so fascinated by your childhood and how you grew up. And honestly, I was like, my God, I wish I was in like a community like that. That was just so amazing to be exposed to these different disciplines, these different cultures, these different philosophies and religions and spiritual um, paths so early on in life. It just opens you up in so many ways, because we are, I mean, growing up in the US, you're already in a culture that's been sort of the center of gravity already. So you have that, you don't need to learn American culture. You are, you know, you grew up in the US, you are American. And on top of that, you have all of this other exposure
Yeah.
besides the, you know, besides Christianity, besides Judaism, besides the main monotheistic religions in the world. And to have that context is an incredible gift. And I actually want to just acknowledge you in so many ways, because I also feel that humanity at this point is really needing the dialogue between these different disciplines, between these different religions, and to have a greater understanding of, hey, we're actually just all human beings trying to make sense of the world, and coming to a point in this Anthropocene era, the sixth one, I think, where, you know, we actually are looking at existential, real existential crises and questions that we have to resolve together. And I love that, you know, you have a way to access wisdom and language in a way where you can actually bring a lot of the various camps together. And I think that's super valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, actually to that end, there's a little story and a really important moment in the history of Tibetan Buddhism that I actually would love to share with you and
Please.
with listeners. So around close to the turn of the century, so in the late 1800s, you know, Tibet, I think a lot of the time, especially from the West, we think of Tibet and we think of it as, you know, like as a clearly defined unified region. Of course, there's political, there's a lot of different ways of understanding Tibet politically, but I think what a lot of people who haven't studied that region don't realize is how extreme the terrain is, and therefore how different different regions within Tibet are from one another. And there's a saying that one of my Tibetan professors would say, which is like every valley a different language and a different teacher, like a different dharma almost. So there was like at that time there was, you know, there were all these monasteries and they had their own schools of thought, they had their own ways of writing, they had their own ways of teaching, they had their own interpretations of Buddha Dharma, all of that, and they were often in conflict with one another, and so there was this really magnificent moment that happened where there were three lamas who came from somewhat different lineages, who all felt the deep and profound need to unify, to create a sense of unification among Tibetan Buddhists. And so they together and separately over the course of a long period of time traveled to every single, like the most remote regions in Tibet, the most remote caves and villages and monasteries, and received the empowerments, received the teachings from every single one of those traditions. And in some cases, there were places where there were no lamas who had received, you know, like extensive education that were there to share the teachings. In some cases, there were only like old women who had received them decades previously, and they sat with those women as their teachers to receive the empowerment and the energy of each of these traditions. So that they would hold them inside of themselves, and that unification would happen inside of themselves, rather than creating, you know, like, oh, we're going to make this like a meta school that'll encompass all of the schools, and we need all the money to, you know, to create this massive new monastery or something like that. It was this very humble, very personal, very internal process. And they trusted one another. The three of them trusted one another to be holding this power. And that became known as the Rime movement. And a number of the Tibetan Buddhist teachers, including Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche, who I study with, are connected with that lineage and connected with that. So even though there's still associated with a very clear specific lineage, there's a way of approaching Tibetan Buddhism that does encompass all of these. And when I reflect on my life and my incarnation and the life that I was born into, I feel like, I mean, I never had a choice. I was born into a really rich interspiritual environment with parents who were very, very deeply committed to the deepest relationship with these traditions possible. And I feel that my life is to some extent to fulfill something kind of like that, to seek with as much integrity as possible and with as much humility and curiosity to hold the depth of multiple traditions, whatever traditions I'm fortunate enough to be generously invited into, as possible. And I think that there's a lot of people who feel the same way. And I think that having shared language and being able to talk about the fact that we feel that that's part of our dharma, our path in this lifetime, to hold many different traditions, I think allows us to actually step into, you know, a higher integrity relationship with that, rather than kind of stewing in the shadows of colonization is real and ongoing. You know, cultural appropriation
Yeah.
is real and harmful. We need to be able to hold the complexity of all of that if we're going to hold the beauty of these traditions, with integrity.
Absolutely. And it is a journey. It is a process and it's continuing. And it's not just with someone who grew up in an intentional community. It's really with all of us. I mean, I'm from Hong Kong, you know, I grew up a certain way. I'm Chinese, but then I'm also, you know, global. And I'm also, you know, so we're all, I mean, these days, honestly, in variously different ways, of course, right? Some much more obviously than others, but every person is unique and we all carry such our own sort of imprint and our own sort of signature of a particular vibration of that's a combination of who our ancestors were, to the environment we were brought up in, to whatever we are doing today, right? And so it's a wonderfully human thing, and it's flawed and it's okay. And I think that's, you know, that's, I would not like us to, you know, I would like us to rather kind of really embrace this as just an ongoing process. And there's joy in it. You know, there's frustration. There's also a lot of joy in it, and there's a lot of inquiry, and that's just kind of a microcosm of life right there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, and one of the things you said that was so beautiful is the idea of holding everything. Excuse me, holding this understanding within, and not necessarily like, oh, I'm going to have to build the next best whatever meta school of, you know, traditional ancient wisdom for modern times, you know, or whatever it is. And you know, it's actually something I would like to delve a little bit deeper into, because for me personally, it's I've gone through, of course, my own spiritual healing, my own sort of journey, as most people do. And then, you know, I came to this point where it was like, okay, that's fine, but how do I then bring this into the world? How do I connect this out? You know, because even if we understand that we're going to be creating the same, repeating the same external manifestations of whatever it is that we build, if we ourselves do not change or do not transform in some way. So you can have the best intentions, but if you're still creating from a wounded place or a traumatic place or a place that isn't, you know, um, aligned, what is going to come out of that is still going to be misaligned. And by the way, again, there's nothing wrong with that, because we all do this all the time, all of us, but that there is a deeper inquiry and opportunity to go where it's like, okay, well, if I'm going to take this a step further, what is it going to look like in the world? And for me, that's my connecting point from individual personal transformation into regeneration.
Yes.
So yeah, I wanted to kind of bring that into the regenerative movement,
Mhm.
and how you also, I'm very curious, went from, you know, your upbringing into, it's like, oh, okay, great. And then now you are very much a regenerative counselor. You are very active in the regenerative movement. How does that work for you?
Yeah, well, so I'll share a little bit of how like the term regeneration kind of entered into
Hmm.
my life and my existence.
Right.
Which is that, while I was in college and in school, I was and continue to be very passionate um, about social justice and equity, and healing our world from a human perspective, and
Hmm.
healing through our social ills. And of course, I had a deep passion for environmentalism, and my partner at the time and he was very, very focused on environmental studies, and we were very aware of like the weird sense of conflict that seemed to exist between people who were saying we have to address climate change and people who are saying we have to address racism, and we were like, actually they have a lot to do with one another. We need to
Yes,
talk about this.
exactly.
And at the time, I was beginning to receive some trainings in restorative justice from a really incredible mentor and teacher of mine, Mara Schiff. She's a professor here in Florida and really, really incredible person. And Orion was studying, my partner at the time, he was studying a lot of sustainability things and also like restoration ecology. And we were both feeling very frustrated with the term restorative in both ecological and social context. We were feeling really frustrated because we were like, we don't even know if there is something good to go back to, and if we did know how to go back there, we don't know if we actually can. Like, is this actually the term that we want to be working with? And we were also frustrated with the word sustainable because we were like, what does this even mean? Everything's getting greenwashed, and the word sustainable, it feels like it triggers the immune response of capitalism, but not in a way that is actually productive, because it connotes a sense of stasis rather than movement.
Hmm.
And we know
Hmm.
that we live in a perpetual
Hmm.
growth society. We need perpetual growth in order to sustain our way of life. That's the idea that has kind of driven our world and economy for a while. And so we were just like, what could we replace these words with? And just as a thought
Hmm.
experiment, we came up with the word regeneration because it felt like it was pulling from the past and definitely in a relationship with creating future. And so we started just having this thought experiment where in our minds or in our writings and our readings, we would just replace the word restoration or sustainable with the word regenerative, and we just would see what happened. And it was like the world heard us and was like, yes, this is the way that reality operates. And reality just kind of revealed this gorgeous um, feast of solutions for healing our world to us that integrated so much of the wisdom of the wisdom traditions that I had been raised with the social analysis that I had been studying, with our understandings of ecology and soil science and our
Hmm.
hydrological
Hmm.
systems. They all became deeply, deeply integrated together, to the point that when I talk about regeneration, it is omni-inclusive. It is inclusive of our psychology, of our spirituality, of our ecology, of everything that we
Of our
do,
health,
of our
even
health.
everything.
Absolutely,
Hmm.
everything. And this speaks to the way that all living systems operate. When you take a living systems perspective, you begin to see how everything is living systems nested within one another.
Exactly.
And so if you understand one principle of living system at the scale of, for example, your body, then you can understand
Hmm.
how it can manifest within a city, and you can actually design for a city's improved health. And we can do this on all scales. If we understand how our solar systems operate as living systems, we can apply that to microbiology. We can apply that to how we nurture our gardens. We can apply that to our social systems. So I think there's something that's really powerful and really important about linking. I feel like what you were speaking to before was very much about integration,
Hmm.
about
Exactly.
pulling together all that we are, and that is a regenerative process. I think that integration is a regenerative process, and
Absolutely.
yeah, so I love playing with those concepts together.
Totally. I mean, one of the reasons why I did this podcast and why it's called How Things Connect is
Yes.
precisely for that reason. I mean, it's all about integrating heart, mind, body, and spirit, both on a personal and planetary level. And, at risk of kind of sounding like a tagline, but the truth is behind that is that's also what I saw. And I was like, okay, but what's the language? How am I going to translate this so that people don't just think of, oh, well, this is just for personal spiritual growth. as a hobby on the sidelines on weekends. You know, it's like, no, this is something we can really incorporate day to day, and it's super pragmatic, because it's part of life. It is literally life and how life works as living systems in nature and in every aspect that we see. So now I love that you came to that conclusion. And also now, you know, there's so much, I mean, I suppose the term regenerative movement came into the world, I want to say, what, 8 years ago, 6 years
Because
ago,
my
when it
journey
really,
is so separate from
yeah,
it was like
probably for
after.
you, like for the last 20 years, but for
Yeah,
me, no, for me, it's like recent.
but I think yeah, 5 to 8 years. I feel like that's when it started kind of gaining momentum, and then it
Yeah,
really become a meme at this point, and it's a meme that
exactly.
I'm very curious about how different people are applying it and how different people are integrating it into their lives and their work, and that's something I get to discover a lot in my work as a regenerative counselor. I talk to a lot of people. You know, people are attracted to that term for many different reasons and always
Yes.
curious, and it results in some really fascinating conversations about how people are applying and integrating the regenerative ethos. That's kind of what I call it. I feel like it's a meme, and I feel like it's an ethos of reality that many of us are tapping into. And because we all have different points of entry, we all have different backgrounds, we have different cultural backgrounds that we're drawing from, we have different traumas, we have different perceptions about the world. It manifests completely differently for everyone, and it's really fascinating to have those conversations.
It is. And I'm also just so grateful that there is that term. So we go beyond sustainability, because, you know, the whole stasis implication of that word it just doesn't quite work. And what I love about regeneration is this idea of, you know, leaving things even better than they were before.
Yes.
So whether you're looking at soil regeneration or life regeneration, like instead of just sustaining your health sounds like you're barely alive.
Yeah.
You know, whereas regeneration means you're regenerating yourself. You bring in more energy, you bring in more, just more richness in every aspect of life. So there's that implication, for me at least, of that word, whether it's on a personal or sort of a global basis. And yeah, and it's important, it is important actually to clarify that a little bit for people. And one of the things that I also find interesting, you know, reading about the regenerative movement and people who are writing about it, talking about it, is this idea of intergenerational, um, not just composting the past, allowing it to disintegrate and creating that as fertile, you know, soil for the future, but also looking back into these wisdom traditions that you mentioned, or looking into indigenous wisdom traditions that are still present, that we can, thank goodness, still have access to if we're fortunate enough. And of course, so many of these communities are endangered, and are constantly persecuted. So, you know, I feel also there's that aspect that we're also starting to bring back. And whether it's through, like, for me personally, it's through a lot of the work that I do in wellness and in bringing plant medicines to more people. And, you know, for others, it may be different. But there's that idea of stewardship that, of course, Indigenous peoples have been doing for millennia, but that we have, you know, as modern folk, have kind of lost that connection a bit in terms of how we are very much responsible for the earth and for how that sustains us, regenerates us. So, you know, there's that lovely honoring of our ancestors, of our past, that again brings in the history instead of denying it, instead of kind of disassociating from it. That is beautiful as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also I feel like I would be remiss not to mention, just as you were speaking, I was reminded there's a really exciting upcoming. I don't know if it's a series or a workshop, but I think it's going to be the beginning of something really significant and beautiful. But something that the Llama Foundation, which is based in New Mexico, is hosting, that's called ethical interspirituality, something along those lines. And it's a group of some really, really incredible people who are developing a conversation specifically around interspirituality, but I know that with the foundations of the interests of the people coming together, it's going to open up a lot of different doors. It's Mirabai Starr, Lila June, Nikisha Breeze, and Mona Haydar. So like just a really amazing group of people that I feel like if people are just like juiced by this conversation and they're specifically want to go deeper into this consideration of how these wisdom traditions, and including and especially Indigenous wisdom traditions, can be deeply honored and integrated into how we approach everything we do in our lives, I feel like it's going to be a really rich gathering and just the beginning of something really special.
Thank you for mentioning that. And actually, that leads to my next question for you, which is the Buckminster Fuller Institute and also Design Science Studio, which you were part of the first cohort, because now, okay, so there's a regenerative movement. Well, how do we design for that? And that's something that you've been exploring for some time. Can you share how, sort of what your insights have been so far? I mean, obviously, it's an ongoing exploration. And especially wanted to ask you about this idea of pluralistic collaboration, and how this is a question that I have personally. I know people do, others do as well. It's how do we make it smoother, less clunky, because that's when everything kind of gets all constipated sometimes.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm definitely interested in designing for smoothness, yeah, for things to be elegant and effective. And as we are like navigating our way through so much complexity and often a lot of chaos and often a lot of like, systems of even just like bureaucracy of the world that we have all inherited. It can be really hard to be organizing together, to be gathering together, to be and to be designing well. So I'm very much continuously in this process of wanting to refine. I think this is a really key Buckminster Fuller term that is where the Design Science Studio kind of name emerged from. He called for a comprehensive anticipatory design science revolution. That's something that he called for in the last century. And it's very ambitious, right? It's comprehensive. We want to design for things that are whole systems oriented and that look at the biggest possible picture. Buckminster Fuller is famous for saying, if you start at the scale of universe in regards to problem solving, you avoid leaving out any key variables. And we live in a dominant culture that is so focused on reducing things to their parts and just reductive way of looking at things. And so, the comprehensive foundational element of what Buckminster Fuller and so many of us are incorporating into our approach requires a lot of unlearning and a lot of challenges to the way that we've been taught to think about things. So it's comprehensive, and then it's anticipatory, which is we have to look to the future. We have to be able to anticipate the challenges that we might be facing in the future, which is also something that's not easy to do. And then, of course, it's design science. So it's bringing together art and science, and it's bringing together scientific ways of thinking about things with art and culture and elegant, beautiful design. And then the final element of that is revolution. Like this is a call to really, really substantially and radically change how we operate as a species, living within and among and in relationship with this incredible biosphere that we call home, this incredible planet. And so I think naming the design approach thoroughly in that way is an important starting point for really orienting around how do we do this? How do we approach doing this? And I'm finding that some of the collaborations that have come forward in my life from the design science studio have been incredible experiences in applying these principles and really experimenting with them and seeing what's happening. And you and I were most deeply connected through one of those collaborations with Julian Guderlei. We and three other incredible collaborators, but Julian and I met through the design science studio. The five of us have created this Presence Foundations course, which is the 6-week course that is really about nurturing the state of being that is foundational to everything else that we are need to and can and are capable of doing in this world, which is a grounded capacity for presence, and not just as an individual on a meditation cushion a couple times a day or a couple of times a week. It's about integrating it into our entire lives. And there have been a number of other really amazing collaborations that I'm involved in as well. But I actually would really love to know from you what your experience with Presence Foundations has been like, and how it's informed and perhaps adjusted your way of understanding the regenerative movement and how you can embody these principles inside of yourself.
Thank you for bringing that up. By the way, I loved the experience with Presence Foundations, and I really highly recommend that to anyone listening. So what was fascinating that I did not anticipate, because I started off going in knowing a couple of the people already who were part of the, who were one of the two of the teachers. And what was interesting was how it became sort of an accelerator for everything else that was happening outside of Presence Foundations. So not only was it great to connect with other like-minded people, which by itself is incredible. We've been all isolated because of the pandemic. We've, for me particularly, because I live in New York City, it's been very hard because I don't get to go out into nature as much. And normally I really need that. And so it was a great way to meet new people, to make those connections based on shared values. So that was incredibly, enriching. The second thing was that the whole ethos, or the whole ethos of presence and being is incredibly important. And even though we know this intellectually, and we even know this in our hearts, and we know this every time we meditate or whatever, it was really, really helpful to meet twice a week, essentially, and for 6 weeks straight, and to actually practice that continually, and to be called out to then go into the breakout rooms to connect with the various people that I may not have met or known, and to really just be in our vulnerability, and to call each other out in that as well. Not call each other out in a bad way, but really just to show up ourselves in that way, which then allows others to do the same. And there's something very magical about that. So it developed a greater sense of trust, I think, in the things that each of us already believes, but kind of were like, yeah, we know this is true, but how does it actually work in life? And can we actually make this happen instead of it being a fantasy of some ideal world that we would like to live in? And so I would say that on that note, it allowed me to embody all of my beliefs, in a deeper way. And I think that that is something that all of us crave, especially those of us who are already on this journey. And, how do we do this instead of it just thinking of it as some dream? And, will this happen? This may never happen. Oh my God, it actually is calling for each of us to embody this, to practice it on a daily basis. And that's very challenging, because most of the time it's very hard to trust, which is the next thing I would like to bring up, is that in this collaborations, why sometimes it doesn't work is that there's somehow there's broken trust, and then we come back into our default way of being, which is this defensive way, which is, by the way, understandable given the world that we live in. And, of course we should have healthy boundaries as well, but if we're going to start to create that new sort of direction for all of us, we start from ourselves, and we have to kind of step into that trust. So that's, I think, a huge part of these communities, these design science manifestations that come out, is how to build trust, how to build, excuse me, mutual trust with each other, so that we can allow ourselves to be fully seen. And I think
Yeah.
that's critical.
Yeah. And I think that there's I see them as being mutually informing and kind of like being in dance with one another. But I just also want to speak to the absolute necessity for nurturing self-trust as a part of that. So
Absolutely.
there's like trust from within, and then there's mutual trust. And sometimes we don't even realize that there are wounds in our capacity to trust ourselves until we experience another person trusting us deeply. And similarly, sometimes we don't realize that we have that there was a lack of trust with another person until we address some form of self trust or lack thereof within ourselves. And that's something that I've just been in really deep contemplation around for a long time, but especially through COVID, I think, because of, so much misinformation and so much really compelling, chaotic information out there in the world, and people who I really love and in the past who I've trusted have seemed to be existing in very different realities from me in times of COVID. And I'm really interested in like cult dynamics and what goes on psychologically that allows us to fall into cult traps. And so COVID's been a very rich time of contemplation around a lot of those themes. And so I've been having to continuously go back into this continuous self-reflexive process of needing to trust myself, but then also not just being in a place where I think a lot of people's approaches is like, all you need to do is trust yourself and your body, and then everything will be fine. And it's like, sometimes we actually need to place our trust in larger institutions or in professionals who really do know what they're talking about. And it doesn't mean blind trust, but there's it's a dynamic, nuanced process continuously to be existing in reality, and in a reality that is so profoundly chaotic and confusing and difficult to navigate all of the time. We need to be able to have, honest conversations with people like, oh, there's this story about reality that I'm hearing. And I trust your discernment. Can we talk through this so that I can come to a place of clarity? I had a friend who had a lot of people in her life who really were very anti-vaccine, and a lot of people in her life, including her own family, who were very clear that being vaccinated was an absolute necessity for them to be around her. And she wasn't sure. She felt conflicted inside of herself, and so she called me and she was like, I know that you're vaccinated. I also know that you had COVID. These are both things that are true about me. And I also know that you're discerning and critical about, about the medical system and all of these things. Can we have a conversation? And we had a really rich, beautiful, vulnerable conversation about everything that was going on in her mind and that was influencing her. And she did end up making the choice to be vaccinated. And it was an informed choice. It wasn't coming from fear mongering on either side.
Right.
And that's something that I think is really important continuously. Is I feel like no matter what kinds of communities we're in, I think we're always being exposed to this message of that other thing is trying to control you with fear, and it's super evil and you should be afraid of it. And this place that I'm offering you is the only place that there is, safe haven. and so I'm like, wait, but you're fear mongering. You're just not self-aware about it. And so there's just like all of these layers that we have to continuously be trying to understand.
Oh, it's tricky. Yeah.
How are we being?
Yes.
How are people trying to control us, even by narratives of saying this is what liberation looks like, or this is what sovereignty looks like? We have to be really, really.
Thank you for bringing that up.
In this process.
Yes.
And with one another. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up because, it's almost something at this point that I'm almost scared to bring up
Yeah.
because, it's like, oh, I don't want to get into trigger someone and it just gets messy. But I think the point you're bringing up is integrity, right? The integrity to question, the integrity when we have new information to be open to questioning, right? And when we have new information, respond to it accordingly so
Mhm.
that we're not stuck in one dogmatic way of being or believing, but to have true inquiry and whether it's scientific or philosophical, it's the same. You there has to be an openness and
Mhm.
an ability for, if it's a free society, to actually have these discussions without having either side kill each other or want to like strangle each other, and that's seemingly recently becoming rather difficult, but it's something I think that bears that all of us bear, it's important for us to remember, um, because that is the basis of what it means to be sovereign, what it means to be human, is to be able to and to have integrity, is to be able to be open to questioning and also to assessing for each of us, and to
Mhm.
respect each other for whatever conclusion that we reach, right? And again, it's a fluid process, it's a continual process,
Mhm.
and yet we sometimes, in the process of wanting to, whether it's self-protect, protect loved ones, we lose track of that, and it's okay. And I really would love to see more of that, to be able to discuss things that, okay, may seem very odd to someone else and maybe pigeonholed as, oh, that's just this or that, regardless of which camp that's coming from, to be able to just really look at facts and kind of go, well, okay, well, is that true? Let's look at the evidence, or let's look at the argument of why you're saying this.
Yeah.
And yeah, and that's super super important, so really bringing back the integrity.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we can do this with so many things. We can, and I think it's just so important for us to know ourselves and to know
Mhm.
our the ways that maybe we self-defensively can get sloppy in our thinking, or
Yes.
different kinds of things, to just know ourselves, and to have compassion for ourselves and others, and to know that,
Yeah,
yeah, that, like, okay, maybe I could be wrong about something for a while, and it's
exactly.
never too late for me to wake
Change
up
your mind.
and change my
Yeah,
mind. It's never too
exactly.
late to realize, to apologize for harm that I've caused, or
Hmm.
acknowledge something like that. And I think that's something that I really learned from my mother. She's always my whole life been saying, oh, I just love being wrong. Like, I love being proved wrong. Like, and it was a little bit of a mind fuck, excuse the term,
Yeah.
as a child, where I was exposed to a world where it seemed like everyone was always, positioning themselves as having all of this confidence, and
Hmm.
being often very attached to their truths and their realities. And for my mother, who's incredibly wise, to always be saying, oh, I'm so happy to be wrong. I love being proved wrong. I think modeled a form of kind of intellectual humility that I think we could all use. And it's still,
Absolutely.
I want to be right about things. Like, it's my ego doesn't like being proven wrong. And also, there's something that's such an absolute relief when you're just kind of like, oh, okay, actually, like, ego, you can chill out now. Like, my consciousness is curious, and maybe even curious about a way that I've been wrong, or a way that I've caused harm, and I'm curious because I have a longing to be in good relationship with the rest of reality. And, like,
Hmm.
I think that's like the crux of everything for me, is like, are you longing for, or motivated by, like, healthy, sacred, however you want to call it, but by good relationship with the rest of life? Because if you are, then if somebody points out that something you did was racist or harmful or whatever it is, then you can say, oh, wow, if that's a real thing that I did, that's inconsistent with the way that I long to be in the world. And thank you so much for being generous enough to let me know that I could do better. And then actually, you know, we take ourselves through whatever process it is to actually do better. Yeah, that's a big piece of what integrity means to me. And there's a lot of humility for that.
There is, here, and just bringing number one, humility, but also some levity as well. And forgiveness, of course, because it's forgiveness of ourselves. It's like, okay, you know, hey, I mess up. So, okay, I'm sorry, you know, please forgive me. And it allows us again to forgive the other as well. So it's beautiful. And this is my default, and whether it's, you know, however you take this, but I default to levity and that sense of humor, because it's all a cosmic kind of joke, I think,
Me too.
to source, you know. And it's like, okay, I've now thought myself into a corner and this is ridiculous, I'm going to stop and I'm going to go about, take a walk in the garden or something like that. One last thing I suppose I would love for us to discuss is, you know, back to the theme of regeneration, back to this ability to shift according to what is necessary of what life is showing us, right? That is a very alive process where, you know, the opposite of the regenerative way of being is very much extractive. It's a deadening process because it's basically kind of reducing something to its, and by the way, there are absolutely reasons to do that in you know, for certain in certain disciplines, and I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, again, taking out all the value judgment out, you know, from it. But, you know, this the deadening process is when we start to how do I say this, reduce something to the point where it actually loses the essence of the wholeness. And, you know, as one of my guests, Rishi Chitananda, recently said, it's like that reductive logic which says God is love, love is blind, therefore God is blind. And it's like, okay, that does not exactly, right? And so so I suppose a big part of then my question is, how do we re-enliven ourselves in this process? How do we incorporate more of life into ourselves? One of the things you mentioned a long time ago, or actually I read this in something that you wrote, that it talks about, you talked about genius and how 98% of children ages 4 to 5 test as geniuses, but then that number drops to only 2% by adulthood. And that the main cause or the main factor has to do with cultural conditioning carried out by some standard educational parenting approaches. And so you basically talk about the whole idea of divergent versus or constructive thinking versus convergent and critical thinking. Now we need both, of course. So how do we then incorporate this? Is this the way to kind of always have a balance of this? Is this how we bring more life, more aliveness into our lives?
Yeah, well, so the distinction that, I love that you brought this up. Yeah, so the really interesting thing about the distinction between and there's a couple different ways of talking about it. I think what I'll say, for just simplicity, for listeners' sake, I'll talk about critical versus constructive, because I think that's the easiest for most of us to wrap our head around. But we need both of them very, very much. And I've actually been recently reading this incredible book by Leonard Shlain, The Alphabet versus the Goddess, which I strongly recommend. And especially, he's a neurosurgeon, and especially the chapter on right brain, left brain, it was very, very illuminating for me. But we need both of these skills, right? We need critical and constructive. The challenge, the one of the things that happens in our dominant culture that is one of the most harmful things, I think, is that we're taught where those two ways of thinking are smushed together. And we're expected to be able to do critical and constructive thinking at the same time. And a really perfect example is when we're coloring, like we're using colors, we're playing with colors, but we have to do it inside the lines. We're doing it all trying to do it all at the same time. We're writing, but then the editing brain kicks in and is so hypercritical of us that we're not able to get anything out on the page. And we have this constant voice in our heads. I know so many people who were raised, very bright children who just have so much procrastination and so much like analysis paralysis because of this perfectionism of, I have to create things, but they have to be perfect. That's the constructive brain wanting to create, wanting to express itself, with the critical brain, kind of wrapping its arms around it and being like, it's not safe to fully express.
Mm-hmm.
You have to stay within these certain bounds. And so something that I strongly recommend to people, and that I bring people through, and actually there's a ritual guide that I think is like $30 on my website, that is designed to support this. It's called Embodied Genius. Is if we can actually cultivate our ability to do to do both at different times, and kind of like how Ernest Hemingway, though like not the best example of being a human, but he would say like what write drunk, edit sober, something like that. Like it like it kind of like ritualistic
Yes.
delineate the states of being that you're entering into for the different tasks that you have at hand. So in the ritual guide, I bring people through a process of bibliomancy, because I know a lot of people who really struggle with reading books these days. Our attention spans are completely fractured because of the culture that we live in, and it can be very difficult to sit with, whether it's on a Kindle or a PDF or a physical book, to sit with a book and actually read it cover to cover. Most people that I know really struggle with this, and it creates a sense of self-doubt. It makes, I talk to a lot of people, especially women, who tell me that they spent so much time as a child just reading books, just absorbing and reading voraciously, and that something happened as they grew up, and they can't sit down and read a book, and they think that they have this story that they're stupid, they have this story that they're not intelligent enough, and it affects their entire lives. So this is something I've been teaching people for a while, and I made this ritual guide to just gather together a bunch of books that inspire you. It could be a poetry book here, a nonfiction book here, one of your favorite novels here. Maybe gather together three books, create a ritual container, clean your room, light some candles, set the mood, whatever is appropriate for you. And then just allow yourself to open the books randomly to random pages and be with the wisdom that emerges. Just be in that totally creative, totally constructive kind of space where you're like, oh, this line from this poem and this paragraph from this book and this piece of dialogue, how can my mind make connections between all of them? And this is like so great because for your podcast, like how things connect. It actually invites your mind to be in active creative participation with the authors of these other books, where you're making meaning, you're making sense, and you're making connections and receiving guidance from all of that together. And then you spend some time, like journaling and integrating and refining what you're seeing and the connections that you're seeing. And then maybe you go back and edit that. Maybe you bring a critical lens into it, but maybe you don't. But either way, you're creating the environment for your mind not to come in and say you're doing this wrong, or say, oh, that's not what that author meant. You're actually
Love that.
very
Yeah.
proactively creating an environment that is super flexible and co-creative, and that unlocks so much in people's minds. It unlocks so much in people's creative capacity. It's amazing. And I think if we're able to really nurture that, where it's like, I'm gonna throw all this paint on the wall, on this website that I'm creating for someone, and then we're gonna go in together and pare it down and refine it. But it's going to be a scheduled time that we're refining it, that we're pulling it all together, that we're getting it crisp and clear and elegant for public viewing. But we've been able to throw out all these words and all these ideas onto it beforehand. Like that's such a beautiful process that we can incorporate into everything that we do, to the benefit of everything that we're trying to do.
Lovely. I love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I've got to, sorry, you just got me thinking I've got to go to your site and download that book. So where do we find you? What's the best
Yeah.
way to
Yeah, so
do that?
I'm incredibly inactive on social media these days. I haven't logged into any social media for about a month now.
Mhm.
But
Your
yeah,
website?
my website is the main place. And that's just my name, gangadevibraun.com. That's GangaDeviBraun.com.
Yeah, I'll put
And
that
there's
in. I'll
a
put that
number
in
of
the notes.
perfect, yeah, and there's a number of ways that that you can connect with me through there, that you can there's a number of different ritual guides and little booklets that I've created, including for shadow work and for partnership, and a number of different things that can be useful to people. And really the main place that I'm like teaching and interfacing with people these days is through Presence Foundations. And so if anyone's listening and is curious and interested in participating in Presence Foundations, we'd love to have you. And I'm finding, yeah, that everything that I'm doing is just going deeper and deeper. I think that's why I'm stepping away from Instagram and Facebook and everything, to just really go deep with smaller pockets of people, so that we can really accomplish things together and really go deep together. So that's actually it's a new thing for me, but I'm really enjoying that process. So yeah, if you're listening and you want to go deep, there's a lot of ways to do that.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I feel you on the social media. So absolutely. Thank you so much, Ganga. What a great discussion. Thank you for your time. And thank you for being on How Things Connect.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's been such a pleasure, and I look forward to so many beautiful conversations to come.
Same here. Same here.